Cristo on talkRADIO.
But let's crack on with the political panel this evening here on talkRADIO, and I'm joined on the left by the journalist and campaigner Mike Buckley, and on the right Alys Watson Brown, political commentator with Young Voices. Evening to you both.
Hi there.
Good evening.
Now, Mike Buckley, we normally don't do a boomerang, but we're doing a boomerang Buckley this evening, and we have asked you to come back to us in the same week so much. And Alys, by the way, you are very welcome as well. But just I don't want you to feel left out. But there was such a reaction to what you had to say earlier this week, Mike, regarding Omicron restrictions, whether we were right not to bring any in comparison to the rest of the UK. And you made the assertion that sort of going out on New Year's Eve was like sort of wandering around with a loaded gun. So careful did you have to be to make sure that you didn't harm other people. You likened restrictions to stopping people sort of running riot with guns. Do you still stand by that?
That was not my best analogy, I have to say, and I realise it had some impact. And the point I was trying to make was that we all need to be aware we could infect other people. That is a dangerous thing to do. We should be very careful. And the other point I was trying to make was that the restrictions we put on people to protect others, it's like we don't let people drink and drive. We don't do that because we know it can harm us, we know it can harm other people, and that's what we do. And the same is true with gun control. However, I think the gun control, analogy I made was probably a little bit of hyperbole that maybe went a little bit too far.
But don't you even think sort of, being drunk in a moving 1-ton vehicle and potentially hitting someone is a little bit of hyperbole if you consider that passing on Omicron to someone, it will most likely be a very, very mild illness?
It will, but not for everybody. We know that. I mean, some people will be hospitalised, some people will die, some people will get long COVID, some of them will be sick for a month, some of them will be sick for 6 months, some of them won't get better. So we all need to be aware of that. There are things we can do to make that less likely. So if you're going out for a drink, you don't drink and then drive, because that's now pretty much illegal, and that is a really good thing. And with Omicron, we can all put masks on when we go to public places, we can take a test before we go out. There are things we can all do that still enable us to live our lives, but make sure that we're doing what is within our power to make sure that it's as least likely as possible.
Alys, what do you have to say to that? The way, taking lateral flows, wearing masks, taking those sorts of precautions is akin to not getting into your car and drinking before you drive, because it's the kind of protection that you give to other people being a part of a society. Is that a fair analogy, Alys?
I don't think it's a fair analogy. If it was a fair analogy, then all of us would have to perform breathalyzer tests and then upload them to a government app so the Highway Standards Agency could see our alcohol content before we got behind the wheel. As well as the fact that Omicron is nearly not as severe, hospitalizations are down, cases are high, but if you compare it to the data of this time last year, honestly, some of the lowest of the pandemic as a whole. And we had some very early evidence of that from South Africa. No hospitalizations by the time Omicron reached the UK, with only 26% of their population being vaccinated, when our population, by comparison, through vaccination and natural immunity, 96% of the UK population have those antibodies and have that protection. So I don't think it's a fair analogy at all. And I think it's quite demeaning to people who have actually been killed by drunk driving to compare it to that.
Mike, do you want to respond to that?
I don't think it's demeaning at all. I mean, if you die from Omicron because somebody infected you deliberately or accidentally, or you die in a car accident, you still end up dead. And it may not be the best analogy out there, but I think it's a reasonable one. Just a couple of other things that you said. Hospitalizations actually are higher than they've been since, I think, the 11th of March. And they're 11,000 and something, and they're going up. And that the hospitalizations we have now, by the way, don't really include the Omicron surge, because it takes a while, it takes a few weeks for somebody to get infected, then get ill, then end up in hospital. So the hospitalizations we have now are not really Omicron related, they're much more Delta related. We will see the impact of Omicron in hospitalizations and sadly in deaths, in coming weeks. So at the moment, everybody's saying, "Oh yeah, look, cases are up, hospitalizations aren't." Well, that's simply because it takes time. So
well, the hospitalizations
are.
are at 9,937, I think is where we're at with hospitalizations right now. Is that the latest?
Well, I think if you look I was reading the Guardian live feed, so I had the latest.
Well, I mean, in fairness, Mike, I don't mean to be funny, but if you read the Guardian live feed, I'm surprised you ever leave the house.
Well, it's a fair question. I do sometimes leave the house. You'll be pleased to hear. I'm not here the whole time. And yeah, I think we're up to I think it's 11,000 something, but obviously correct me if I'm wrong on that. But certainly they're going up. They're only likely to go up more. And the other point to make is, of course, we don't know where we're at in terms of cases, because they've run out of tests, so we're kind of flying blind at this point. And in terms of South Africa done really well. Let's hope that every other country that is infected with Omicron does as well as South Africa.
Okay, well, but if we go by figures which NHS England released today, which were relating up until December 28th, I take what you're saying. Things may have changed on that, but this was only fed down to the media today. The number of people who are in hospital being treated primarily for COVID, so not in hospital for something else and then testing positive with a form of COVID, they are in there specifically for COVID, that is actually falling. That's at a rate of 67% as of the 28th of December, down from 74% at the start of December. So the hospitalisation figures with COVID doesn't necessarily correspond, even if they're going up, to people being in there specifically just for COVID. This argument is made so often, and if I'm honest, I genuinely really don't understand why people are constantly drawing this distinction with going in with COVID or for COVID or whichever, preposition you want to put in front of that word. They're in hospital and they're very ill with COVID. No, because they've gone in for something else, Mike, and they are testing positive.
Divided into 2 or 3.
No, because there's a massive difference between those things.
It's a vital difference.
Go on, Alice, you say it. Go on.
It's a vital difference. If you are not put in hospital primarily because of COVID and are marked as a COVID hospitalization and used in analysis such as yours, that's hugely misleading and fear-mongering to the general public. It's not an accurate depiction of how harmful COVID is to the majority of the healthy population.
Well, even the senior NHS medics, I was reading an article about this as well today. I've clearly had a.
Were you on the Guardian again, Mike?
Well, I may have been, though. I have looked at a number of news sources today, so I honestly can't remember where it is. But there was a senior medic was talking about this today, and they don't have the figures to distinguish between the two. And they as well were saying, well, it isn't that different, because some of the people who are in quotes, with COVID end up getting seriously ill and dying, and some of the ones who are in there for COVID end up going and dying. For the obvious reason that if you're in hospital, you're very unwell anyway, and are therefore likely to have fewer defences against a coronavirus infection wherever you caught it. And I would imagine that a bunch of people go in there.
That doesn't necessarily mean that COVID has killed you. It means that you have died as a result of something else with COVID, because if COVID specifically killed you, it would be very different. But if you go in with as a result of having a car crash, and I don't know, you have hideous internal injuries from a car accident, yet you happen to test positive with COVID, you cannot possibly compare that someone who might die from those horrific internal injuries to someone who goes into hospital because specifically they've got problems from COVID.
But you know what? Life is complicated. And I mean, you as well as very sadly, as sure as I do, know people who've had cancer, say, for, a number of years. What kills them in the end is pneumonia or something else, because actually their body is very weak anyway. And it may well be people who are ill with something else, and they're therefore less able to cope with the COVID infection. Maybe they would have survived the other thing, and then they get COVID and then they die.
Well, then that counts as a comorbidity. Sorry, go on, Alice.
Yes, it does, but COVID is still involved. Therefore, the conclusion.
Why lock up healthy people, as you say,
by keeping COVID rates down? It's the same conclusion. And we're also talking about an NHS which is becoming overwhelmed with COVID. Well, COVID being a factor, whether it's the only thing they have or whether it's one of the things that they have. People are still ill. They'd be better off if they didn't have coronavirus.
God, Alice, respond to that, please. That there is no real distinction.
There is a huge distinction. I'm sorry. I've had anecdotes of people whose family friends have actually died in a car crash, but their death has been registered as a COVID death. And now they're fighting for it to be changed on their death certificate. It's not, you cannot use that in an analysis. It's wrong and misleading. You say these people, obviously, people with cancer, dire pneumonia, I completely agree with that. You are right. But you cannot, that is still not an excuse to look up healthy people. That is what the NHS is there for. If you look at the deaths from the flu figures in 2000, they were detrimental, higher than the deaths in 2020, I believe. Yet Tony Blair or the Labour government did not choose to limit the movements of the people. They chose to look at the NHS and go, how can we reform it? The NHS is there for us, not us for the NHS. There is a huge difference. We are a state with a health service, not a health service with a state.
All right. And I have to take your word for those figures, Alice, because we can't verify them at the moment. But look, we'll come back to both of you as well. Mike, I've got to give you credit. You staggered me the other day, and I love you dearly, but you've done it to me again today, and I don't think you expected to. When we come back, we'll hear more from Mike and Alice about these stories and a few others thrown in as well, right here on Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Still joined this evening by my political panel, and it is, of course, Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner, Alys Watson Brown, political commentator with Young Voices. Evening to you both. As I said before the break, Mike Buckley, I've got to give you credit. I love Mike Buckley. I love you dearly, Mike Buckley. I genuinely do. But you've done it again. You've left me speechless, and I've got to give you credit for that. And I just want to reiterate, so someone gets run over, they get hideous internal injuries by being hit by an HGV, they get tested in hospital and they're positive with COVID, and you believe that even though they will die by having an HGV drive over them, that those figures should be included in the COVID deaths?
You're picking a rather extreme example, I think, and I think there are different.
Excuse me, Mr. Drink Drive. Don't tell me about extreme examples.
There's going to be a gradation. At one end of the scale, there's those people. You're right. They're knocked over. They go in, and then somehow they catch COVID, and then they die anyway because of their horrendous injuries. At the other end of the scale, somebody who's only got COVID, they go in, they die of COVID. In the middle, there's lots of complicated factors like somebody's age, somebody's pre-existing conditions, their vulnerabilities, another disease that they happen to have that maybe they've been managing perfectly fine for years, and then they get COVID and they've killed them, and it kills them. But they're more likely to die because of the other thing that they've got. So the world is complicated. Health is complicated. What we know for all of those people is that they would have been better off and probably more likely to survive in probably all of those cases if they didn't get COVID. Therefore, let's keep infections down.
I'm cancelling your Guardian subscription, Mike. I'm worried about you, genuinely. Alys Watson Brown, what do you want to say to that?
Well, firstly, I'm still trying to process the drink driving analogy, but I know we've covered that. I think I figured out, but I think that I really do understand the argument you have that if people have illnesses before they get COVID can, finish them off possibly, which is awful. But that has been the same with every other seasonal flu illness that we have seen. So why is COVID different if it has quite 99.9% survival rates? People are vaccinated. People have shown that they are willing to take care of their own health without government restrictions, shown by all the testing that was done over Christmas, hence why we've run out of lateral flows. You can't use data in that way when it is just misleading.
All right. Well, let's move on to a couple of the other stories that have caught our eye today. We've had some New Year messages from some of our leaders. Sadiq Khan is promising an amazing light show in London. I will be amazed if that firework display is anything other than Sadiq Khan's face in fireworks, frankly. We've had Keir Starmer giving us droning on for over 5 minutes. And we've had Boris Johnson telling us not to lose weight. Should we hear a little taste of do we need to hear a taste of them? I don't think we do. I think you both are across their speeches. Let's start with you, Alice. Anything excite you out of any of those three speeches?
I sort of was quite interested by Keir Starmer's speech, actually. His focus on security quite interested me, especially given the criticisms that Sadiq Khan has gotten over the pandemic period for not tackling things such as knife crime, I don't know if it was aimed to remedy the criticisms of that, but I think it was quite ironic when he said everyone has a right to feel secure in their work. If they work hard, they will get rewarded, when he voted against vaccine mandates for NHS workers. It's not to say that I agree or disagree with that mandate, but I think for people who have worked in the NHS possibly their whole life to be, laid off because they decided not to get a jab, it seems a bit ironic. But then he goes to say that he would achieve security by creating police hubs, which seemed quite confusing. And another point, I think he must have, if you compare this speech to his conference speech, his hand gestures and his gesticulations, are a lot less predictable and a lot more fluid. So I think he must have maybe been trained, or maybe it's the nature of a lucid speech, but I found that was quite a marked difference.
Okay, true, but I think that still, it did go on for a long time. Well, that's nice.
Yeah, it wasn't very
You've said something positive about Keir Starmer. Mike Buckley, you know what that means, don't you? You need to now say something positive about Boris Johnson's New Year's speech. What have you got for us?
You asked me to do the most difficult things on this show, Cristo. Just the last thing, and I promise the last thing I wanted to say on COVID is, I was just, when we were in the break, I was checking the stats. And we were on about 750 a day hospitalizations from October, which was where it started, until 17th of December. It's now over 2,000 and just going up. And apparently even the worst it ever was in January, which is 4,000 a day. So we're very quickly going in the wrong direction. But anyway, you've asked me about Boris Johnson's speech. Keir Starmer's speech, I thought it was good that he was talking about crime and security as well, because it's something that the public are always more concerned about than I think it gets into most of the media or hits most politicians. So I'm really glad that you was talking about that. In terms of Boris's, I think the best thing that can be said is he was upbeat. And if there's one thing that Boris Johnson does well, it's being upbeat. Now, there isn't always any reason for him to be upbeat when he is being upbeat. He's often being upbeat about things when actually everything's really terrible. And I think people are beginning to see through that now. But you know what? It's New Year. It's good that he was being cheerful. It's good that he was being upbeat. He was saying that everybody in the country has been offered every person over 18 has been offered a COVID booster vaccine, which is good. Not everybody's taken them up, of course, which is maybe the more important point. But nonetheless, credit where credit is due. If people have been offered, that is a big step in the right direction. So I'm very pleased about that. He was also being upbeat about tech investment in the UK. That is also a good thing. I think any investment in the UK is very welcome. So I'm very pleased about that. There are, of course, lots of economic statistics he didn't talk about, but I'm supposed to be positive, so I won't talk about them either.
Oh, well, I don't know what to say. This is just such beautiful peace and love between the two of you, coming up with some positive stuff. Can I say something negative then? Keir Starmer droned on for too long. Sadiq Khan will make that his fireworks all about him. And Boris Johnson was staggering in suggesting that it's easier to get a booster than it is to lose weight. Factually, he's probably correct, but really very much the wrong analogy when you consider getting some weight off is probably something that will save you from a serious bout of COVID. So there you go. I'll do the negativity on all three. Just to finish off, from both of you now, where you've probably got about a minute each, what are the stories that will stand out for you this year? Give me one story each. And Alys, I'll start with you.
My favourite story of the year was actually reported in the Metro in September of this year. It was about it's not very serious. It's about a runaway iguana in a pub in Kent, which is quite local to me, and it was sunbathing on the roof of a pub at lunchtime.
Oh.
And they've called it Ronnie the Runaway Iguana, and I thought that was really quite exciting to read amidst all the COVID headlines.
I'm amazed it made it through with all the COVID headlines.
Exactly, and he didn't even wear a mask. I'm just shocked.
Did he get sunburn?
Well, I don't know. He was obviously after the vitamin D and the pints, so maybe he's showing.
He didn't die of sunburn, did he? Did he die of sunburn? Mike, you'd have it put down as a COVID death, wouldn't you? Mike,
almost certainly. I think we can just take that as read now, can't we?
What's your biggest story of the year, Mike?
Well, it's not my biggest, but I think it is. I was just thinking today about a story that I was trying to think of something funny and I failed miserably. But the story that I think just mostly kind of took me aback in recent weeks, anyway, and just made me think, oh, we need more people like that. Now, Mark Drakeford, I'm talking about. And I don't mean this as a political point, even though he's a Labour person at all. But I was just really struck when this video came out of him, and he'd like stayed in his granny flat last year for months on end to protect his wife and his mother-in-law, who were both vulnerable. And I just thought there's a real gentlemanly character to that, and a kindness to that, and a simplicity to that, you know. And I was just struck by somebody doing the right thing. And I'm not saying that because he's a Labour person particularly, but I just thought it was a really good example. And I bet there are millions of people across this country who are also doing the right thing.
It's nice that he's locked down the rest of his country in the way he locked down himself, isn't it, as well?
Yeah.
I was being sarcastic. I don't think you were you, Mike?
No.
Listen, on that note, we'll leave it. Mike, you're a great sport for coming back on and coming back with all of that. Alys, we've loved having you as well. Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner. Alys Watson Brown, political commentator with Young Voices UK. That was my panel this evening.